Hey folks, good afternoon as welcome as people join. We're just going to hold for a few more minutes before we get started, but we're really excited to have everyone here. Welcome again, folks. We're just going to wait till a few minutes after the hour to get started. We appreciate everyone coming. So excited to have you here and for this great discussion. So stay tuned for like one more minute and then we'll get started. All right. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad that you're able to join us for today's webinar on state level sexual orientation and gender identity data practices, inclusive data responsible governance, co-hosted by the Center for Democracy and Technology, the Movement Advancement Project, and Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. We're really excited for this conversation. We have a wonderful slate of panelists. I'm going to do some sort of introductions, housekeeping, and then we'll jump into the conversation. We will have at least 15 minutes of time at the end for questions. So we'll have a lot of time to dig into these issues in more detail. But really wanted to set up here at the top of the call the kind of two simultaneous forces that are sort of shaping, why this report came to be. So on the one hand, over the last year, we've seen increasing threats to administrative data held at the state level as a result of the Trump administration's efforts to dramatically expand access to and consolidate this kind of information at the federal level. At the same time, we've also seen the federal government take extensive steps to take down data collections about LGBTQ plus communities. So we're in this tension point where, on the one hand, really critical data about LGBTQ plus communities is increasingly less available at the federal level. And when that information is also collected and held at the state level, it's under greater threat for attack and weaponization. And so this report really seeks to intervene into this and makes a call to leaders at the state level to say, now more than ever, responsibly collecting and handling this information is really important and really thinks through what does this landscape mean for us and what are concrete actions that lawmakers and administrators can take to address some of these concerns and gaps. Our panelists today have a really wonderful range of experiences that will help us flesh out this conversation. So I'm really excited to introduce them in a moment. Before I do that, I have a few housekeeping items for folks. The first is I'm going to drop a link to the report that we will be talking about. Um, so please dig in there if you have questions about anything in greater detail. We go through a lot of this stuff in the written report. And as you may have noticed when you joined, this call is being recorded. Like I said earlier, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen that you can use at any point throughout the webinar to submit a question. I will be going through them during the Q&A and pulling out key questions for our panelists to respond to. And then one other note I just wanted to give folks, you may hear a lot of us use the acronym SOGI throughout this discussion. That is an acronym that refers to sexual orientation and gender identity. So you'll hear a lot of us say SOGI data, and that is referring to data about sexual orientation and gender identity. So with that, I'm going to run through some introductions of our panelists, and I'll give them some time to introduce themselves, and we'll jump into our questions, which we've really tried to shape to go from big picture landscape setting to specific concrete actions. Okay, so with that, first up, Carolyn Medina is a senior advisor for data policy and strategy at the Movement Advancement Project, where they lead research, policy, and advocacy initiatives to strengthen the ethical and responsible governance of sexual orientation and gender identity data. And Caroline brings a deep expertise in LGBTQ plus data policy, having previously held senior roles at Whitman Walker's Institute for Health Research and Policy, the Center for American Progress, and in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Next, we have Della Jenkins, who is the Executive Director of Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. In this role, she oversees the initiative's daily operations and strategic partnerships to promote the development, governance, and ethical use of integrated data systems across the country. Prior to joining AISP, Della's professional experience included advocacy policy analysis and mixed methods research and program evaluation. And last but certainly not least, we have Priya Nair, who serves as the newly appointed Executive Director of the New York City Commission on Gender Equity. Most recently, Priya served as Deputy Chief Diversity Officer for Governor Kathy Hochul, where they led statewide initiatives to strengthen equity and inclusion for both the state workforce and communities across New York. In this role, Priya also advised on LGBTQ policy and served as the lead author of New York State's guidance on collecting sexual orientation and gender identity demographic data. Prior to that, Priya was the Associate Director of Gender Equity at New York City Health and Hospitals, the largest public healthcare system in the nation. So, I've said a lot of things to introduce our panelists. To have them introduce themselves to you, I would love for you each to go around and quickly share what SOGI data governance means to you and how it shows up in your work. So maybe we'll go in the order of intros, starting with Caroline first.
Great. Thanks so much, Quinn. I'm really happy to be here with y'all. As Quinn mentioned, I lead MAP's research, policy, and advocacy initiatives to strengthen the ethical and responsible governance of SOGI data by government entities in particular. And for me, I think a key part of SOGI data governance is about building systems that are both trustworthy and usable, where LGBTQ communities help shape what data are collected, how they're protected, and how they're used. It also shows up in the design of safeguards that prevent misuse, which we'll be talking about more today, while still enabling the production of high-quality data that drive evidence-based policymaking, enforcement of civil rights, and intersectional research that benefits LGBTQ communities, but also the public more broadly. So I'm stoked to be here and looking forward to today's conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Caroline. Della, I'd love to have you introduce yourself a little bit.
Sure. Thank you, Quinn. I'm so excited to be here. Nice to see you all. So we define data governance in the report, and I'm gonna take my prerogative as I think we were AISP's report or definition was the source of this. So I'll say up front, we define governance broadly. We're not just talking about kind of data management practice. We're talking about the people, policies, and procedures that determine how data are managed, used, and protected. So people is really forefront in our definition of governance, and I think that's really important. It's about humans having conversations about how we use data. And to me, governance is really about weighing the risks and benefits of data use. And I'm going to talk more about this later, but that's particularly important when it comes to the use of SOGI data. In the work we do at AISP, I support state and local government agencies who are working to collaborate and use public sector administrative data according to shared values and shared guardrails. And that's really where governance comes in. So we work beyond just SOGI data with a lot of different types of public sector information, creating spaces where risks and benefits can be discussed honestly and transparently.
Great. And Priya.
Yeah, so well, first off, I just want to thank Movement Advancement Project Center for Democracy and Technology and Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. This is such a cool webinar. And I love this report. It's like I was reading it, before bed last night. I have my printed copy right now, so I really encourage everyone on the call to check it out. And I love this question, right? I think, what does it mean to me, SOGI data? I think on a personal level, for me, I think from a user perspective, it also feels like it means, being able to be seen by kind of like society, by government, by community when I'm, interacting with those systems. I remember when I was at New York State government and helped to get the gender X markers implemented in on state identity documents. And I remember getting my first New York State driver's license with an X gender marker and just feeling just so seen and affirmed in who I am. So I think that that's on a personal level, just having that experience. But I think on a policy level, I love nerding out about SOGI data collection, but I mostly came to this by circumstance. As you mentioned, Quinn, I'm currently at the New York City Commission on Gender Equity, which is a New York City government office, but previously I was in New York State Governor's office. And at the time I was there, the governor enacted a law to collect sexual orientation and gender identity data collection, which I'm happy to go into more as we continue the conversation. But we needed someone to kind of jump in and help get agencies up to speed on the law, help to facilitate implementation. And I was just the kind of the first one who raised my hand. So I'm by no means like a data wonk expert. It's just something that I have learned on the job and am really passionate about both personally and professionally.
Great. Thank you all. I mean, I think this kind of sets up a really nice on-ramp into our conversation to both tie in what this means for real people's lives when they are accurately represented by data collected about them, and also what it means for the real people working in government that have to figure out how to do this stuff because it's not necessarily a clear-cut decision. So I think that really kind of sets us up for our first sort of kind of questions I want to pose here to really lay out the landscape of benefits and risks we're seeing right now. So Caroline, I want to turn to you first and kind of have you lay out, given the significant changes we've seen at the federal level, both in regards to attacks against administrative data privacy and against LGBTQ plus rights, what are some of the current risks and benefits surrounding SOGI data governance at the state level?
Yeah, thanks, Quinn. So I think this is a great starting point, right? We need to recognize that SOGI data can be both incredibly valuable for advancing equity, but also potentially sensitive information that requires strong protections. And both realities, I think, need to be taken very seriously. And in the current federal context, where we're seeing, as you said, systematic removal of SOGI data from federal data sets, but also heightened threats to data privacy and ongoing attacks on LGBTQ rights, that balance becomes even more important, I think, at the state level. So on the benefit side, when SOGI are collected and used responsibly, it makes LGBTQ people, visible in the systems that shape policy, funding, service delivery, et cetera. And that allows governments and other stakeholders to identify disparities in access and quality and outcomes across a whole host of different areas that impact people's daily lives. And those data can be used to support more equitable allocation of resources, more targeted program designs, and more evidence-based policymaking. So that's all hugely important. They can also play an important accountability role. So when data exists, communities and advocates can use it to document those inequities, identify gaps, and push for meaningful change. So in that way, SOGI data are not just like a technical output, but they're also tools that can support actions by communities, by advocates, and governments to improve these really crucial systems over time. I think it's also important to name what happens when LGBTQ folks are not represented in data systems. So, as we highlight in the report, invisibility in data is not a neutral decision. When SOGI data are missing from administrative records or surveys, governments lose the ability to see who is being served well and who is being left out. And that means it becomes harder to identify inequities and to monitor whether programs are working as they're intended to, or to ensure that funding is actually reaching the populations it's intended for. So it really limits the capacity of government to design responsive and effective policy. At the same time, as you've noted, there are definitely risks. So risks of SOGI data misuse are real and have to be taken seriously. Misuse or unauthorized disclosure of that kind of demographic data can do a number of things. It can reinforce structural discrimination, for example. by enabling biased decision making in healthcare, housing, employment, etc. It can also be used in ways that contribute to surveillance or enforcement practices that target and disproportionately impact LGBTQ people. There are also deeply personal harms, I think. So even the perception that sensitive data may not be protected can deepen stigma and erode trust in government systems. And in cases where data are improperly disclosed, individuals can face outing or harassment or family rejection or other social harms, particularly in environments where stigma remains really high. And importantly, those risks have system level consequences. So when people are worried about how their data will be used, they may choose not to participate in surveys or those collections. They may avoid public programs or they can disengage from services entirely. And that reduces participation in exactly the kinds of programs that are designed to support people's well-being. And it also weakens the quality of data and the ability of governments to understand and to respond to the needs of the full community. So I think, I guess I'll end on sort of a plug for the report, which is really intended to support state and local government stakeholders at different stages in their sort of SOGI data collection journey, to support them in making sound decisions about how SOGI demographic should and should not be collected, used, and shared. And our hope, I think, is that it provides a rubric for those to do really intentional, honest risk-benefit analyses, as Della was sort of talking about.
Thanks, Caroline. I think, that really kind of outlines the stakes here. And, one thing I'll pull from the report that you were kind of alluding to in your remarks is the risks in terms of the ways this translates into concerns and barriers for people accessing programs aren't just theoretical. We include information from survey polling that several of our organizations have done that show majorities of Americans are deeply concerned about the privacy of their information collected by governments. And even some people express an unwillingness to seek out public benefits programs or services if they were uncertain about how their information might be protected. So this isn't just something that we're saying might be a risk. It is a real, tangible, on-the-ground risk, which leads me to Della. You were kind of already teeing up for us in your day-to-day work how you directly work with governments to evaluate these exact kinds of risks to make smart decisions about how they approach data. So could you kind of give us a sense of what are some of the key considerations that policymakers should have in mind when they're evaluating these kinds of risks and benefits around SOGI data collection and sharing?
Yeah, thank you, Quinn. I'll say the context is everything here, which is why it's hard to give blanket recommendations for consideration. So I'm going to lean on a framework that we use a lot at AISP that I think is helpful when we're thinking about how to generalize across really different contexts. And this is a framework we call our four questions. And it came to be originally because in our work supporting state and local data sharing efforts and integration efforts, the question was always to us, can we share this data? Can we share this data? Can we share this data? For all the good reasons that Caroline outlined, where data can be used to improve programs and support people. And we said, there's like really complex considerations. You want a really easy yes, no answer. Here's how we think about it. And in this report, we apply this to SOGI data specifically, and I think kind of problematize like how do we think about this at this current moment. So I'll say our four question framework is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it a good idea? And who decides? And so those are our four questions. And I will very briefly kind of talk through why I think they're helpful frameworks for policymakers making these hard decisions right now. So I'll say, starting with is it legal? This is the floor, right? This is the lowest bar. We all need to follow the letter of the law. We have a lawyer on our team who holds us accountable and who helps the states we work with make sure that they're doing this too. So that usually is when people ask us, can we share the data? That's usually what they actually mean. First and foremost is it legal? And we can talk through the nuance of that. But our framework is intentionally broader than that because in addition to asking about appropriate legal safeguards, We need to ask questions about ethics, about capacity, and about decision making. So, ethics considers what is good for individuals, communities, and society at large. And it surfaces this key tension that Quinn and Caroline already teed up, that individuals have a right to privacy and data can be misused if they're disclosed inappropriately, and that data are a public good we can use to make better decisions to support people. And so, as stewards of public data, we have to grapple with this tension, which is a lot less clear than just is it legal? It's so much murkier than that. And ethics are personal. We aren't always going to agree on that risk benefit calculus. But that doesn't mean we skip the question. It just means we need to engage more deeply in conversation about it and with more voices, more diverse voices at the table. So that's, is it ethical? And I think policymakers know that that is an important consideration, but often have trouble operationalizing how to get to an answer there. Um, we intentionally add this third question, is it a good idea, to get at data availability, resources, and capacity for action. So even if a use or a disclosure or a collection of data is deemed legal and ethical, we don't want to pursue that if we don't have the ability to do anything meaningful with the data if we had it. That would be a waste of resources. It would be a waste of the people's time who we've asked the sensitive question, right? So that is the not a good idea use case. And finally, the fourth question, who decides? Strong and inclusive data governance practices are how we know if data collection, access, and use is legal, ethical, and a good idea. It's the framework that allows for that deliberation and decision making. And so, we encourage policymakers to really think across all four of those dimensions of considerations when we're thinking about collecting, using, and protecting SOGI data. And the report kind of goes through a little more how to operationalize that through actions.
So now that we have some of this broader context, both for the policy environment that these decisions are happening in and the kinds of considerations that Della just outlined for us that should inform these decisions, I'd love for us to kind of transition to part of the conversation to think a little bit about how this um, translates actually in practice to the state level. So I'll bring in Caroline and Priya here to think both about sort of generally best practices and then what does this mean when it happens on the ground? So Caroline, what is sort of the current landscape of state law and policy governing both the collection and protection of SOGI data? Um, and like kind of set up for us like why these matter, especially right now with what's happening at the federal level.
Yeah, so at the state level, the landscape for both policies governing SOGI data collection and protection, I would say, can best be described as a patchwork. So on the collection side, we've seen relatively small but important set of states, about 11 states plus DC, that have enacted laws or executive orders requiring the collection of SOGI data by government entities. And it's worth noting that in all of these cases, the data collection requirement is paired with a key safeguard, which is that folks are not required to answer the SOGI questions, which aligns with widely recognized best practices for asking these questions. But within that group of 11 states and DC, there are a couple of important distinctions. So some states have adopted broader requirements that span multiple sectors of government, meaning that SOGI data are collected, SOGI data collection is expected across a wide range of different systems. Other states have more targeted requirements for collecting these data in specific sectors, and most commonly that's public health or healthcare or education settings. And across all of those states that I've mentioned, the emphasis is really on administrative data systems more so than surveys. And SOGI data collection is often being integrated alongside other demographic variables like race, ethnicity, and disability status. At the same time, it's really important to note that this statutory landscape does not capture the full picture. So there are also state agencies and programs that collect or report SOGI data for specific projects or reporting needs without an explicit legislative or executive mandate. So that suggests that the actual practice is more widespread and a little less uniformly governed than what statutes alone would indicate. On the protection side, states also vary considerably in how they govern data privacy, access, and secondary use of data. So there are state privacy laws that apply to government handling of personally identifiable information. There are program-specific state legal requirements, state contracts, data sharing agreements, and in some instances, state constitutional rights to privacy. So states play a really critical role in shaping SOGI data governance safeguards. And I think to the second part of your question, Quinn, why this matters in the current federal context is that this fragmented landscape now carries much more weight than it might have in the recent past. So as federal data collection on SOGI becomes more limited, state level systems are increasingly central to whether LGBTQ populations remain represented in data infrastructure that really drives policy, funding, and service delivery. But it also really raises the stakes for governance. Where states are expanding or maintaining SOGI data collection, they're also taking on responsibility for ensuring that strong protections are in place so that data used to advance equity doesn't inadvertently create risk through misuse or unauthorized disclosure or erosion of public trust, which is also very real right now. So I think the aim and the hope of the report is that it serves as a tool to help stakeholders be clear about what data is needed and why, and what protections are in place, and who should have access, and sort of the key questions that Della was talking about as part of that sort of risk-benefit analysis, and locating themselves within that broader landscape, which as I said, is really a patchwork.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. Well, I mean, I think, as we heard from Priya, your intro, you've had to deal with some of these issues firsthand. You were in one of these states that has a SOGI collection requirement. And so I think it'd be great to dig in a little bit more about what this means in practice. Because, I think the kind of consistent message we've heard from all panelists is like, it's really complicated and also really important. And so it matters that there are people doing the hard work to figure out how to do this right. So given your kind of experiences, especially in New York State government, how have you seen state laws and policies around SOGI data collection protection impacting the on the ground decisions about and decisions and practices about this data in government?
Yeah, Caroline gave such a great overview of the landscape across the country. Very happy that New York State is one of those states with a SOGI data collection law on the books. And just to give some quick background on that law, so in 2023, Governor Hochul signed the law, and it's kind of similar to what Caroline was talking about. It's a very broad SOGI data collection law, so it's not limited to certain agencies. It applies to all state agencies that collect race or ancestry or ethnic origin data. So anywhere they collect that demographic data, the law requires them to now update those data systems and collect sexual orientation and gender identity data as well. And New York was one of those states where even without the law, we also had certain state agencies collecting SOGI data voluntarily, mostly like in the Department of Health context, but it wasn't a comprehensive approach. It wasn't a consistent approach. And so this law was a really big deal for us. And, I know people think of New York, you think of us as being the first and being super progressive, but it took a long time to even get to passing the law, signing the law. It actually was vetoed a few different times under previous administrations and in previous years, largely due to cost. I think it wasn't so much a policy question as more of a kind of infrastructure and funding question, because these data systems, there can be hundreds, right, in a state government, in city government, in a county level government. And the reality is many of them are legacy systems. It's not always easy to update them. I remember one like IT person describing it as like a web of yarn, and you start pulling one piece of the string and the whole thing comes undone. In my mind, I'm like, oh, we could just add a new field, right? It's easy. We could do that overnight. But no, it is a lot more complicated in practice. And I think that's where kind of the messiness more in the weeds part comes, is after the law, you have implementation. And that's not something that gets like the press release. It's more something that public servants are trying to figure out. And I would say, in terms of how the specific New York State law has affected implementation, particularly in this context of kind of privacy and the changing landscape, I'll point out that the New York State law has certain flexibility in it. And it's an interesting model to look at. So it requires, again, state agencies to collect SOGI data where they collect race to the extent practicable. And that language was purposely utilized to strike this balance between, on the one hand, we want to move forward with SOGI data collection. We know it's important. And then on the other hand, there are contexts in which this may not be possible, whether it's like there is not funding to support a system upgrade, or it's going to take several years, or in the case of a privacy concern, right, that it may not make sense in a certain context to add SOGI data. So I think that, at the time there was maybe some concerns about that language, that it would allow state government to kind of avoid accountability here. But, now I think looking back, that's just my personal opinion, is like it's kind of a blessing in disguise, especially as the federal landscape has changed so much. And I'll point out one more thing about the law, which is that it does have a accountability measure for state government. So in addition to requiring the data collection, requiring state agencies to report publicly on the data in aggregate form, of course. It also requires a third component, which is that if state agencies are not able to comply, they also have to publish a report explaining why that is and how they're going to come into compliance, what steps they're taking. So I thought I think the law, like in New York, strikes a pretty good balance there between, again, like accountability, flexibility, and understanding the importance of this data collection.
Thank you. I think that's a really strong example too for kind of illustrating how this is probably going to be an iterative process for a lot of agencies as they implement some of these requirements. So I think that actually really in a nice way takes us to our last section here, where I'd like to think a little bit more about practices that can actually be adopted today, potentially by people. So I'd love to go back to you, Della, to kind of kick us off on this section and walk us through what are some of the key, both legislative and administrative approaches or strategies that states can draw on to advance responsible SOGI data governance.
Yeah, thank you. So there are quite a few of these outlined in the report, and I am not going to go read them all to you all. I'm going to assume if you want to dig in, you will. But I'll say, I'll go over a few, and I'll say at a high level, you know, what I want to highlight broadly is something that Quinn and others have said already, which is that states have a lot of room here to think thoughtfully and creatively about how to strengthen their existing practice right now and use both of these mechanisms, legislative and administrative, to increase protections and safeguards in this moment. And I'm seeing great questions in the chat that I'm sure we will get to later that point to these very real considerations. So, examples of legislative mechanisms that might be used. I think some really important ones. One is designating state data stewardship roles explicitly for each agency. And this is really about making sure it is someone's job to coordinate what these policies are and how they're enforced and communicated across government. That's really important. We also see a role for legislation in updating standards on things like data minimization, retention, and deletion, proportionate to the sensitivity of the data. So making sure that SOGI data, that the real harms that could come from disclosure are taken into account in how we deal with the actual data sets themselves, how long we keep them, who gets to see them for what, right? We also talk in the report about the important role that that passing anti-discrimination protections can play. So this is a strategy, a legislative strategy that's much broader than just SOGI data collection, but has real data implications. And so, we're talking here about strengthening state laws that explicitly prohibit the use of SOGI information to deny access to or participation in state-funded programs, services, or accommodations, or discriminate in employment or housing or any of these other super important social services. Importantly, these types of anti-discrimination protections could also include amending state data privacy laws to explicitly include SOGI as a category of sensitive personal information that is subject to increased protection. So many of you may know this, and some of you may have less of a legal landscape lens. There are federal privacy laws. There are also state laws that are more restrictive. And so states have a role to play here in potentially changing how they handle SOGI data at that level legislatively. Importantly, the administrative strategies we lay out in the report, these don't require legislative approval. And so these are things that can be done right now. They might feel more attainable in some political contexts, and they can be done within the control of agencies. And so this is stuff like auditing your current data collection and data sharing practices, including your legal agreements, your contracts with vendors, your disclosure policies. So all of these things that agencies have that are meant to protect and govern how data are used, but are, as Caroline said, the word is a patchwork, right? These are not always super well mapped or documented. And that is a really critical first step that agencies can take immediately to get a handle on risks and benefits and make changes that are within their control in a nimble way. So, really important. We don't want anyone receiving a strongly worded email demanding data and not knowing who to call or what the escalation protocol is or how to push back, what clarification they can ask for, right? Those things should be on paper, and every employee should know what their role is in that process. Um, we also talk in the paper a bit about technical safeguards that can be applied, and we strongly recommend partitioning and safeguarding particularly sensitive data fields whenever possible. So, for example, if some data collection is federally funded because it's for a federal program, say it's housing, whatever program it is, and that data is therefore going to be requested by federal partners, states may choose to store those data elements separately from additional SOGI data fields they collect about the same program recipients. And that is one way that we just technically ensure that data are not moving without intentionality from one place to another. So there are a couple of other strategies also outlined in the paper, but I think those highlight kind of some big themes in terms of how we think states can move forward to strengthen protections, both at the legislative and administrative level.
Thanks. I love how concrete these are and give, I think, folks a sense of the menu of options. And there's not necessarily one specific place you have to start, but a bunch of ways that you can start. So, Priya, I'd love to turn to you. I think you laid out really well the balance that the New York state law strikes, some of what it was like to actually think about implementing. So I'd love to hear you kind of reflect back and give us a sense about what are some of the lessons that you learned about actually having to figure out how to implement some of these practices around SOGI data governance in a state.
Oh gosh, lessons learned. I feel like I could, write a whole book at this point about that. Um, but I think the first lesson that I gathered quickly was that there's really no one size fits all approach. I think, Della, you also spoke to that. When you talked about the four questions framework, it's very hard to give a blanket kind of recommendation to all state agencies or all states about how to go about this data collection. And in New York State, as part of the law, we in the governor's office developed some guidance for state agencies on SOGI data collection. We did it in partnership with folks like Caroline at Whitman Walker, and we have an interagency LGBTQ task force made up of representatives from different state agencies as well. So we brought those folks together, they looked and gave us feedback on the draft guidance, and then we used that kind of interagency infrastructure for rollout and implementation and capacity building, because that piece of it is also so important, right? You can't just like send someone a 10-page guidance document on how to collect SOGI data and then be like, good luck. So we really took the time to build up that technical kind of expertise amongst our colleagues, and make sure we had that space. But when I say there's no one size fits all approach, I think like on the one hand, I really desired, right, consistency. I'm like, okay, this is such an amazing opportunity to do like kind of a whole of government approach to SOGI data collection, like to the extent that we can have consistent questions across state agencies, even within state agencies that have multiple programs, multiple systems that are all going to be collecting this information. That would be ideal, right? Because then you can better compare data across state agencies. You can better compare data over time. And ultimately, you'll have a stronger, kind of product or, data. On the other hand, right, we have very, very different contexts in state agencies. If you're like going to a healthcare appointment or getting a vaccine, that's like a completely different context than if you are applying for unemployment or applying for a driver's license. So I think that was one huge takeaway, is that the context really matters. And again, you have to do this balance between the consistency of the data and also like flexibility and giving agencies that room to make decisions based on what works best in that particular context. And just to get really in the weeds, we ended up with two different kind of recommended questions for our state agencies. One was in administrative data collection context, and then there was a second set of questions that were slightly different for healthcare related contexts and large survey contexts. And again, that was thanks to the expertise of Caroline and many other folks. But I think that was a good way to balance these different contexts. I'm happy to like share more. I literally could go on about lessons learned, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for other conversation.
No, that's wonderful. And the plug to say, if you do have more questions about lessons learned or anything else we've talked about, now would be a great moment to start adding some more to the Q&A function for our amazing panelists. So we are rounding out almost to the Q&A, and to kind of set us up for that, I do another round robin question for all of the panelists to kind of close this out, and I'll go in reverse order. So Priya, I'll come to you first, and we'll go to Caroline last. Okay, so for all of you, what is one step that state policymakers can take today in order to both advance the collection of SOGI data while safeguarding privacy? So Priya, take us away.
Talk to your lawyers. No, I joke, somewhat. I do think one thing I think a lot about is informed consent for individuals offering their demographic information. I think, Caroline, Della, many of us spoke about that there is a lot of government mistrust. That's for a good reason. LGBTQ people have been mistreated and actively harmed by their government for centuries. And we know that it's even worse now when we have a federal government that's actively attacking us and stripping us of our rights. And at the same time, state governments, local governments are trying to do the right thing here, at least some of them. And I think that the challenge is, how do we communicate to communities to ensure that they understand the purpose of the data collection? Why is it important? How is it going to be used to help you or to help your community at large? And how is this data going to be used? Who's going to see it? Where is it going to live? and what protections do they have, whether it's non-discrimination protections more broadly, or data privacy protections, and what are the potential risks both now and in the future. I think that way, at least individuals can make an informed decision about whether they want to provide the information and what information to provide. So I think that's one thing that policymakers can do if they are going to be collecting SOGI data and or any demographic data, is really providing that information to people so they can make their own decision.
Great. I love that. Della.
I'm gonna say something simple, which is talk to people about this around you. Like if you're in government, um, the idea of like auditing and inventorying everything that you have sounds really technical and boring and overwhelming, but really it's about just like picking your head up and having conversations with colleagues, buying people coffee and asking them what piece of this puzzle they see, because we all see a piece of the puzzle within government, but often the pieces are disconnected or not mapped out well together. So I really think a starting point, an important first step is just to pick your head up and try to get together with other like-minded people in your organization, to inventory where your gaps might be and identify the highest risk places right now so that you can take action. And if you're not within government, I have similar advice, which is like ask your government partners, like ask these tough questions, share this report and ask how they're handling things like this and where those decisions are being made. Because I think that kind of well-intentioned pressure is really important right now.
Great. And to round us out, Caroline.
Yeah, I think mine is somewhat of a combination of the two, somewhat similar. So I do think, as Ella said, not a formal audit of any sort, but I do think doing like state or county sort of informal assessments of what SOGI data are being collected, where are there gaps, where do vulnerabilities exist. I do think that's a really important next step. And as both of Della and Priya said, like doing that through conversations both with community as well as government partners is hugely important, I think, to identifying where those gaps and vulnerabilities exist in particular. I know we've talked a lot about administrative data, understandably, but I would also just say, there are still opportunities, I think, for investment in things like state surveys and needs assessments and having conversations with impacted communities about, in light of the federal withdrawal of SOGI data collection, like what data are you missing or do you no longer have access to, that we can maybe help to fill that gap responsibly at a state level through the appropriate investment and with the appropriate safeguards in place, for example. So I think those conversations and that sort of mapping of the landscape is hugely important right now, and I hope is something that folks can do without feeling super overwhelming.
Okay, I love leaving this part of the discussion on these really concrete steps that folks can take. We now have probably about 10 to 12 or so minutes to go through some of the audience questions that we've got. We've gotten several really interesting ones, and as we continue to go through these, please submit additional questions from the audience that you might have. The first one I want to start us off with, I think, is really getting at the idea of like what is the role of anonymization? So making it so that information that might be collected is not personally identifiable. And related to that, why or why not is the default just to anonymize everything? So I'd love to hear from this group about role of anonymization, when and how it comes to play, and why sometimes maybe it's better to not anonymize data. And feel free, whoever wants to take a stab at first.
I can jump in first and then would love to hear others' thoughts. I saw this question in the chat and thought it was a really good one. I think, the complication here just comes down to how will the data be used. So anonymized data is really useful for certain uses, for evaluation of programs, for mapping data, aggregated up at a geographic level by community. There are really great things we can do with anonymized data. There are also ways that governments are using data, that have to be individual level data in order for them to be effective. So in terms of like actual support for folks in foster care programs or case management uses of data where we're changing how we're supporting an individual based on information we know about their life and identity and experiences. And so for those use cases, there are real reasons that agencies have certain ability to see data, that certain approved people within agencies have ability to see data at a personal level. Um, that said, it is a changing context, and so we can change our decisions about what level of access is appropriate for what use case. And I think it's worth having those conversations right now. I'll say, touching on the kind of question about laws being changed, data being leaked, the federal kind of threat of mishandling of that data. There's also differences in the requirements for how data are reported to the feds, depending on the use and the program. So there are some cases in which states and counties don't have, aren't the ones who get to say whether the data is reported in an anonymized way or not.
Thanks, Stella. And I also think that kind of ties back to your earlier point about the, importance of potentially segmenting data for exactly that kind of reason. Um, okay, I think that actually kind of brings us to one of the other questions we got, which was that, because this report is focused primarily on state and local governments, how are these recommendations sensitive to federal government requests or involvement? And are there safeguards in place to prevent mass LGBTQ data exposure? For example, the issues around the medical record subpoenas of trans patients from certain hospitals in New York. Um, again, any panelists are welcome to jump in on this one.
I can start. I think one of the topics that's sort of incorporated throughout the report is the topic of data sharing agreements between state and federal actors. So I would encourage you to check out some of the recommendations there. We do provide some examples related to data sharing and repurposing of sensitive information. In particular, we've seen this happen at CMS and USDA with immigrant populations and repurposing of immigration-related data. We also do touch briefly on the subpoena of medical records of trans folks. I will say, just in terms of the scope of the report, it's not explicitly focused on electronic health records, for example. I totally appreciate, as somebody that's worked in health data and health policy for a long time, that is a hugely important area of concern right now. And we can see that through all of the litigation that is happening to push back against those grabs of data. So I would direct folks to the report for more on like the data sharing agreements between state and federal partners. And I also know that there are other resources by partners like A4TE regarding sort of practices. How do you shore up sort of internal processes related to HIPAA, for example? So would definitely encourage folks to check out that resource as well. But Della, I wasn't sure if you wanted to speak more, or Quinn, to the data sharing piece.
I'll briefly just say that like I think this is being litigated really hard right now, and I am so grateful to the lawyers who are doing that work. And so like the recommendations are in the report are about, shoring up governance of at the state and local level. But I think implicit and actually I think explicit in the report is also kind of the recognition that what is happening at the federal level is impacting state and local decision making and is being litigated and will continue to be litigated for a long time. And we hope that that all of the shoring up of the state and local data governance is kind of something that can happen while we wait to see how that plays out long term and while people fight the good fight to ensure that data is not turned over until it has to be.
We got some good news right yesterday. The a judge granted the temporary uh, restraining order blocking the disclosure of the trans young people's medical records. So yes, thank you to the to the lawyers who are are doing that important work.
Which I think even underscores the importance of the governance issues that like you need your legal teams involved because like quite literally the sort of legal precedent governing some of the decisions you need to make is going to change in real time and will be cause for reevaluation as some of these cases move through the courts. Um, we got one question through the chat that maybe Priya, I would love to kind of have you expand on for a little bit for us, which is um, how did you deal with concerns around whether and how people feel comfortable reporting their SOGI status when you were thinking about sort of implementing some of these collections in government?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like when we started this conversation in state government, there was also a lot of misunderstanding even amongst staff, right? About, oh, well, there are these assumptions, right? People don't want to share their sexual orientation. This is private information. We feel uncomfortable asking this information. And so there was a lot of like education needed to be done internally as well, just to kind of explain to people some of the research that, and maybe Caroline, you know it better off the top of your head, but I'm pretty sure there's, research that demonstrates that people are actually more uncomfortable answering questions about household income than they are about sexual orientation and gender identity, for example. And so that I think is really interesting and poignant to point out to people. And the reality is, right, people may also be uncomfortable with other demographic questions like race. I know my dad is always like, I'm not telling the government who I am about anything. Um, and so, but sexual orientation and gender identity has historically not been asked in these forms. So I think that there's also kind of like a normalization period that we maybe were in at the time, where this can be another kind of standard question on demographic form, similar to race, similar to household size or household income, similar to marital status, right? And that it doesn't have to be this, particularly sensitive question, though we also know that LGBTQ people do face, particular risks with this data because of the small sample size, because of the, legal and political landscape and the histories of discrimination. So, to answer the question, I think, one was doing that culture change work inside state government, really looking at what the research says around this issue. And then two, I think you have to talk to your trusted messengers and your stakeholders, to again explain, right? This is why we're asking the question. This is why it's important. It's completely voluntary. You won't face any repercussions or retaliation if you don't answer the question. It won't affect your access to services or benefits. It also is okay if you have different SOGI information across data systems, because that's also something that LGBTQ people, I think, often face. They might, when they're applying to one uh, service, they might, indicate one thing and then they might indicate something else, or maybe at a different time in their life, they're indicating, a different SOGI information. And now they have this perceived kind of discrepancy across government systems. Um, so I think that that's another thing, right? Like, it's okay. You can update the information when you want to. So I think just laying out and being able to educate and communicate to individuals, what they're why they're providing the information, what they're providing, and what it's going to be used for is a part of that trust building.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I
Caroline.
can. Yeah, I was just going to add really quickly to what Priya was saying. There's a couple of questions I think about methodology in terms of how do we ask the questions, how do we build trust with communities, what's sort of the evidence behind asking SOGI questions, how do we do that in proxy settings where we have one individual answering on behalf of other people in a household. Unfortunately, in 3 minutes, we cannot get through all of that, but I will try to communicate a couple of things, which is yes, Priya is correct. Some of the evidence that we have on asking SOGI questions shows that um, item non-response rates can be similar to other very commonly asked questions like personal earnings or household income. So I think that's something that's important to keep in mind. There's also evidence that, willingness to share this information increases when key points are communicated, such as how the information will be used and how it's being protected. So that does move the needle. Um, and then there was also a question about gender expression versus gender ideology, excuse me, gender identity. And I would direct folks to what is a very long report. But it was a 2022 report on by the National Academies, a really sort of rigorous, in-depth report laying out the methodological evidence related to asking about sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status. The good news is that there is an issue brief for each construct, so you do not need to read 160 pages. But if you want a deeper dive on some of those methodological questions, that is a good starting point. There has been new research since, but I do think that that is a really comprehensive place to start off by looking.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking at time, and I think we are just rounding on the hour, but I would love to say a huge thank you to Della, Priya, and Caroline for the wonderful discussion today. We're really hopeful that this makes you all just super excited about this report and putting some of these recommendations into action. You can always reach out to the general CDT email that you got when you signed up to the event, and we're happy to pass along questions to panelists and help make connections. But most of all, thank you all for spending an hour of your day with us. We're really grateful and hope everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, folks.